Hello, everyone. This is the 205th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I welcome back English author Mr. Jim Keoghan as we revisit and discuss his book, Highs, Lows, and Bakayokos, Everton in the 1990s. And this was published in 2016. Mr. Keoghan is the author of many books, many of them Everton related, that I have listed on the blog and podcast uploads. Very prolific writer. Well, Jim, welcome back.
No worries. Thanks for having me. Good to talk to you.
Thank you. So let's discuss Everton in the 1990s. So, as we come to this decade of 1990, what was the status of Everton in the English football landscape?
Everton were, first of all, kind of recent champions. They'd won the league in 85 and 87. They'd always been historically one of the biggest teams in the country. When the Premier League was being formed, or the idea was first being constructed in kind of the late 80s into the 90s, Everton were one of the big four who pushed for its creation. So in kind of modern terms, they would be like a Man United, like a Man City. They were a huge club at kind of the forefront of the game. As fans, you'd expect Everton to be challenging for trophies. You'd think we'd be in the hunt for a title now and then. We'd certainly expect to be in cup finals. And I think to that point there, there'd been, I think it was only maybe 2 decades where Everton hadn't won a trophy in the club's history. So it was not like the modern Everton, the kind of younger football fans know, kind of, relegation battlers and this long trophy drought that we've experienced. They were a big deal in English football and very much at kind of the forefront. And yeah, a very different beast, I guess, to kind of the modern Everton that people know.
Before we discuss the problems in this decade, let's go back a number of years to look back at some of the root causes. There was the post Heysel ban and the departure of Howard Kendall to Athletic Bilbao in 1987. That's sometimes listed as a reason for the decline. While these events may not have been the main causes or the only causes for the descent, they did play a part. So, how would you describe this late 80s era, the post title era, where Everton is having some problems?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a very kind of strange time in general in English football to kind of have to sort of be cut off effectively from Europe and have the way that football was developing over there. But Everton, it was particularly, I mean, it was damaging. I think we had this team who I think arguably you could say in 1985 were probably the best team in Europe at the time. It was, they were fantastic to watch. Certainly the best Everton team I've ever seen. I think most fans who were around at the time would agree. I mean, they were sensational. They'd stolen the title in 85, come within a whisker of winning a treble as well, and the double. And then you lose this manager because of the European ban. Kendall moves to Spain to kind of test European football, which was his right. But obviously he'd lost that at Everton. So kind of the sense of building something was sort of lost from the club. So we'll never know how good that team could have been. We'll never know if it's Everton, so it's likely we would have messed it up. But there was a chance there to build on this. It was our greatest ever team, and it was picked apart. We lost players who moved to different clubs to get European football, and that kind of. Although we won the league again in '87, there was a sense that maybe kind of there was a decline coming. Obviously, Kendall moving made that happen. But as you said, it's although a reason, it's definitely not the only reason why Everton sort of faltered in the 90s and beyond. There were many other kind of factors at play. I think as fans, we like to look at that a lot because of who caused the ban. Because it was caused by Liverpool, it's quite emotional to Evertonians. But actually, whilst it was unfortunate, the club didn't have to end up the way it was. There was, just because you lose your best manager doesn't mean you fall off a cliff. So it's yeah, it was definitely a factor, but there's several other reasons why Everton went into relative decline.
And some of the players who departed to play European football include the likes of Gary Lineker, Gary Stevens, Trevor Steven. So much of the backbone of the team would leave year after year for European football. In this new decade, as we come to the 1990-91 season, we have the return of Howard Kendall early in the season, but he's unable to have the same impact as he did in the previous decade. What had been the difference?
It's hard to say, really. I mean, I think maybe Kendall's managerial powers were on the wane. There are plenty of managers who have a golden period, and for some reason they can't sustain that. I think in Kendall's case, he'd come back, he'd done well with Man City, and then he came back to Everton, and he was mediocre. I think second time round at Everton, and then obviously, as we'll talk later on, he came back for the third time, and he was terrible. I think football was changing. Everton's financial position was slightly weakening. I mean, they say never go back, don't they, for managers because it's frequently never as good second time round. So I think we weren't bad. That's the kind of thing under Kendall's second tenure. We were just very, very average. I think we expected when he come back we'd be fighting for the title, and actually we were just sort of a mid-table team going through the motions. Had a few good moments. It was just a very average feel around the club. And again, even when he left the team. It wasn't like we were fighting relegation when he left. It was just kind of we were just bang average, not great to watch. That sense of Everton challenging for titles and cups, it just didn't feel it under Kendall second time round. A real sense of mediocrity was kind of hanging over everything about Everton back then. It was kind of the atmosphere, the squad, the manager, the ownership. It just felt very kind of we were just kind of really sluggish.
Kendall's first return coincides with the end of the old English First Division that's transitioning into this new Premier League. Was the club too slow or unprepared to seize on the new commercial opportunities? In fact, much like Liverpool was accused of in the earlier years of the Premier League.
Absolutely. I think Everton didn't get, despite being kind of one of the drivers for the creation of the Premier League, I don't think, none of us knew really what the Premier League would become. I don't think we thought it'd become the beast it is.
Right.
But Everton were really unprepared for the kind of the commercial realities of modern football. So when football absolutely exploded in the kind of mid to late 90s, Everton remained very much like a football league club, a football league era club rather than Premier League club. Kind of, everything we did commercially, the stadium, slow to even build a shop, that kind of stuff. Often small things that you'd feel around Goodison that you wouldn't. You go somewhere like Old Trafford and you think, well, this is light years ahead of where Everton are. Everton were just kind of really, as I mentioned, that sense of kind of sluggishness that was felt in kind of the late 80s, early 90s. It just persisted. We just felt like we were two paces behind everyone else, and we'd failed to understand that the way football had been for the previous 100 years in kind of the football league era was gone. And actually, you had to do football differently. And there were several clubs who really understood that. United being the best example. Arsenal were pretty savvy. Everton were really just behind the times, I guess. I think that is probably the key reason why we kind of declined relative to our peers. Because our peers at the time, teams like Liverpool, United, Arsenal, eventually all got it. They all understood what football had become. I don't think Everton have ever actually really got their head around it. They've remained off the pace. There's so many examples of where we've just made the wrong decision, or we've been slow and we've been sluggish, and I think that's the main reason why we are no longer part of that group.
During Kendall's second stint, until midway through the 1993-94 season, Everton, as you say in your book, were just ticking along under John Moores and ultimately under Peter Johnson. Can you describe the events on and off the field that led to Kendall's ultimate departure and, again, the inability to match his first stint?
Yeah, I think there was definitely a sense that Kendall it just wasn't working. I think the club and the fans still expected us to be, as you'd imagine, if you've always been a big club and you've recently won titles, you expect to be part of the conversation at the top of the league. And I think the kind of increasingly it was felt that the teams that Kendall was putting out and Kendall's ability to provide that just wasn't there. I think ultimately Kendall's leaving it came down to I can't recall the name of the player. He wants to buy somebody.
D in Dublin.
That's it. And
Yeah.
the club refused it. And I think that was maybe partially also a reflection of where the club was in terms of its ownership and its finances. I mean, obviously, it'd been owned by John Moores and the Moores family since the early 1960s. Moores, he kind of held on to the club into his late years, hadn't been involved in running it. There was a sense of maybe kind of absentee landlord feel around Everton, where we had owners who perhaps weren't as engaged as they had been in the 60s and the 70s and the early 80s. The sense of kind of drift, I guess, at Everton, and that was maybe reflected in some of the decision making, our kind of financial ability to compete. Yeah, and although kind of the Dion Dublin saga kind of precipitated Kendall's leaving, I think there were other factors up at the time, and I don't think the fans were particularly bothered when Kendall left. I mean, it wasn't like, oh my God, we've lost this manager over a transfer. You know, a lot of us thought, well, actually, he's come in. He's given it a try. It just hasn't worked. We're not where we think we should be. And I don't think anyone at the club or even amongst the fans kind of understood the dynamics of what was happening at Everton. I still think we all felt like we were a big football team, and actually the foundations were shifting. I think the kind of the Kendall failure and the Kendall leaving and what happened next, sort of kind of what happened next over the next decade kind of showed us kind of what happened. But those kind of shifting foundations, I think, were evident during that kind of early 90s, but we just as fans we hadn't realized it.
Following Kendall's departure, there's the appointment of Mike Walker, who had done a good job at Norwich. A poor season turned into something worse as Everton were facing the realistic prospect of relegation that would have been unthinkable for generations of fans. Now, you devoted two chapters on this great escape versus Wimbledon on May 7, 1994. Can you summarize the mood of this year and your personal recollections of this still referenced great escape?
Kind of illustrate Mike Walker as like Everton were like a smoldering bin fire, and Mike Walker's like pouring petrol on it. He was just kind of an absolutely disastrous appointment. Even though we courted him for 6 weeks, I think it was 6, 7 weeks. Everton had lost Kendall. We were mid-table. I don't think anyone remotely thought we'd be in a relegation fight. It just wasn't going to happen. And then during that time, while we courted Mike Walker, who, as you said, had done great things at Norwich. We went on a really bad run. I think we lost 6 games on the bounce and we kind of plummeted a bit. But when Walker came in, it was seen as a really exciting appointment with this kind of, this youngish manager who'd been playing very attractive football at Norwich and achieving great things for a club of their level. It was seen as forward thinking. It was seen as kind of we're gonna be playing great football and he'll power Everton back to the high reach of the table. Again, nobody remotely thought when Walker came in, this is going to be an absolute disaster. Just we could not, as fans, envisage what was to come. And he came in, I think he won his first couple of games, he got a few points, and then Everton absolutely fell off a cliff. I mean, it was the football. People often talk in recent years, oh, it's the worst Everton team I've seen. This table. That is the worst Everton team I've ever seen. They were porous. They could not attack. They were kind of tentative. They looked spectacularly undercoached. And kind of you were, as a fan, you were sort of left station like you couldn't really believe what was happening. To be honest, as you go and watching Everton, you turn up thinking like, is this really what Everton are now? We were plummeting like a stone. We just kind of, as I said, we form fell off a cliff. We kind of fell down the table. And like I think maybe like a month out from the end of the season, you start getting that kind of a feeling. A lot of us for the first time, you're thinking, are we in a relegation fight? Are things like kind of that bad? And then we were. And you get to kind of as the final game of the season approached, Wimbledon at home, Everton had reached the point where the kind of the mechanics of the relegation dogfight were such that even if we won, there was a chance that we could still go down. So it was kind of things that got to that level. We of the bottom seven, we were one of the kind of the teams who looked most doomed. And we were playing a team, although Wimbledon nowadays, kind of modern fans are seen as kind of a League One, League Two outfit. Back then, they were a Premier League team. They were having one, I think they're having their best season ever. Their kind of post-Christmas form had been outstanding. I think they were, the team were on huge bonuses if they finished as high as they could. So we were playing a really motivated opponent financially and for their own kind of pride. Wimbledon were a really tough team to play against. They would kick lumps out of sides. They were direct. They were hard. This was not an easy fixture. And Everton were awful. They were kind of you couldn't ever imagine Everton kind of winning a game at that point. And suddenly you're thinking, not only do we have to win, we need other teams to lose so that we can survive. So it was a very strange game. The build-up was odd. I think back then they knocked down the old away end, the park end at Goodison, so there was a quarter of the stand missing, which made games strange. And if you lost a quarter of your infrastructure, the atmosphere is odd. The build-up was a strange feeling too. There was like a definitely tension in the air. There was also kind of a novelty value to it. There was kind of we'd not experienced this before. It was kind of a strange tension. I can recall queuing outside to get in. It was like we queued from really early. I think it was midday to get in. There was like huge demand to be there. It was a really sunny spring day. The atmosphere was strange, and I'd not experienced that before. I mean, I experienced tense games, but nothing like this. There was a nervousness in the air, but there was still kind of weird hope that I think we felt we were too good to go down. That was it. I think we thought like, despite the mechanics of the league and the different permutations of what could happen, I think we felt this is Everton. Surely we can't go down. And looking back on it now, you're thinking we were one of the favourites to drop, really, and it's amazing that we didn't. But there was still that feeling that actually this can't happen to us. So the game begins, and then Everton managed to go 2-0 down in within 20 odd minutes. The first one was a penalty given needlessly away by Anders Limpar. He handles the ball for absolutely no reason in the box. They take the pen. Southmore gets a hand to it, but goes in. I think when that first goal went in, there was a silence at Goodison that I'd never felt that before. It was just a kind of absolute kind of deflation, I guess, amongst the fans in there. And then not long after, Everton conceded an absolute kind of comedy own goal where we just a balls pumped into the box, two players collide with each other. I can't remember, I think it was Ale shoots on goal, it's going wide, and then Gary Ablett kind of puts it in the net. And I think a 2-0 down with 20 minutes gone or 20 odd 25 minutes gone. I don't think there was any fan in that ground who thought we'd come back because Everton hadn't scored three goals for I think they scored six in Walker's first or second game, but Everton weren't winning games. They certainly weren't coming from behind. They certainly weren't scoring three goals in 60 minutes. So I know several fans left at that point. They just couldn't bear the idea of just sitting there for the rest of the game just to watch this kind of club die. So but most remained. And then just before half time, we get a penalty. Again, not a penalty. Anders Limpar blatantly dived. He admitted it as much to me. Graham Stewart puts it away. So 2-1, you've got that kind of little vision of hope. You're thinking, well, maybe. And then we come out in the second half, and kind of not long into it, again, Barry Horn had been at the club for, I think, a season and been unremarkable, really. Not somebody you'd imagine coming to your rescue. Certainly not somebody you'd imagine scoring a 30-yard wonder volley. He did, and I think that made it 2-2. And then I think at 2-2, the atmosphere. I've seen Everton win titles. I've seen Everton win amazing derbies. I've never known atmosphere like that. It was just absolutely incredible. And I think at 2-2. I think you could feel like I think we'll get a third. That kind of sense of like this game could be ours. And when Graham Stewart scored a third, I think about 11, 12 minutes to go. There's just the place, the room. You could feel it shaking. Goodison just went mad. I mean, I can still picture the moment Stewart because I was sat behind the goal in the street end. I can still remember the moment Stewart's kind of terrible, tame, bobbly shot went in the back of the net, and it's just The elation was just beyond belief. I think word had gone round in the closing minutes that actually results had gone our way. So not only had we got the win, but other people had faltered. And then at the end, you've got that kind of unbearable wait for the final whistle. And when it came, just pandemonium, really, just kind of just you drenched in
Was it
relief.
celebration or was it relief?
On that occasion, definitely a lot of relief, but also a degree of celebration, not because we thought this was good, because it wasn't, it's a relegation fight, but actually because the Moores family had sold the club and Peter Johnson was coming in and there was a takeover and he had money. There was a feeling that if he just got over this line, if he just survived, then kind of one of the reasons we declined, which had been the Moores kind of death grip on the club, I guess. If that once that's resolved, we'll be okay. We thought that's been a big reason why we've been in trouble. We'll just get through this, and actually, then we'll have the good times again. So this wasn't like the other relegation fight a few years later. This was a sense that yeah, it's not good. This is not what Everton should be doing, but there is relief, and actually, we'll get through this. We'll go into the summer. We'll give Mike Walker the players he needs. We'll spend money, and this will be a thing of the past. So there was I think that sense of kind of definitely relief, but also we can be Everton again. We've got through this kind of this blip. I think at that date we thought it was a blip. This was a one-off weird circumstance, and it won't happen again. And Everton will be back to fighting for titles and that kind of stuff. And we can look forward to a summer kind of excitement with new money and new ownership and a new part of the ground, and everything's going to be okay.
Despite salvation, the rest of the Mike Walker era was just as disappointing. And after a few months into the 1994-95 season, he was sacked, and this paved the way for the return of former Goodison Park favorite Joe Royal, who had done very well at Oldham Athletic. And this was his famous Dogs of War era and the unexpected FA Cup victory at the end of that season in 1995. Can you describe this era that started in a positive fashion but ended dismally by early 1997?
Yeah, I mean, I said just kind of to go back to Walker. The weird thing was that he kept his job. Nobody really blamed Walker for that kind of the 93, 94 decline. So kind of he was entrusted to kind of oversee Everton's kind of rebuild in the summer. It didn't go particularly well. We brought in, I think, a few players. Brought in Daniel Amakachi up front, and we brought in Vinny Salmaes. So it wasn't like there was a huge amount of money spent, which was kind of surprising because
Almost Mueller, the Brazilian striker, almost
oh
signed.
yeah. Oh, I mean,
Yeah.
again, if you want to, if you want to pay, I've forgotten that. You want a perfect example of Everton not being run properly. There's the Muller saga. You bring him in, you think you're buying him, you don't explain the deal properly. He leaves, and you're thinking we courted Martin Darling all summer and then didn't land him. Stuff like that. Yeah, as you said, Walker. It continued. I mean, again, the form and the football in the first few months of the 94-95 season was dismal. Again, Mike Walker is hands down the worst manager we've ever had. It's just incredibly bad. So we got to November and I think we had like 7 points and we were rock bottom of the league. Thankfully, eventually Johnson pulled the trigger and he brought back Joe Royal, obviously kind of ex-Everton player. He'd done great things at Oldham. Different kind of manager, I think, different kind of football. Oldham had not been known for kind of attractive passing football. They were relatively direct. And he came in. His first game was kind of, a real test. It was a Goodison derby against high-flying Liverpool. I think you couldn't get a tougher test for a new manager. He'd been given a few extra players to work with. I mean, I think towards the end of Walker's tenure, he brought in Durant and Duncan Ferguson on loan from Rangers. Neither had been particularly good under Mike Walker. So I think we all thought both would end up going back to Rangers. Yeah, I think he had like maybe 10 days to work with the team. It was international break when Royal came in. So there was hope that at least this was somebody who got Everton. Royal understood what Everton were. He'd been a youth product at the club, played for us, won the league with us. He was an Evertonian. It's kind of what you want in a manager. Yeah, and then kind of his first game was a good illustration of what Royal football would be. He dropped Salmaes, he brought in much more kind of defensively minded midfield. John Eberl, Barry Horn, Joe Parkinson, Andy Hinchcliffe in that first game. So, four defensively minded midfielders. We won the derby 2-0. Duncan Ferguson scored his first goal for Everton, which kind of transformed his Everton career. And we sort of took off from there. I think Everton's form during the remainder of that season was top six. Which bear in mind just how bad they'd been under Mike Walker. Again, nobody saw that coming. They thought like we hoped Royal would save us, and he did. I think that was a season. I think four went down that season, so it was a tough ask for Royal because they were changing the size of the league, and to add to that, you had like kind of the surprise of the FA Cup, which again, if you'd asked any fan when Royal came in, all we wanted was just to survive, and if we that was enough. That was, I think we thought we were doomed when he arrived. So to deliver that and then to give us our final at Wembley and a victory was just his stock was so high by May 1995. He was absolutely our savior. And again, we thought, well, this is the man to power us forward. We've got Peter Johnson's money, which was beginning to get spent. We brought in Kanchelskis in that summer. We had Ferguson, brought in a few other players, but a style of play that was direct, but it suited us. And again, in Royal's second season, we finished really well. I mean, Kanchelskis was outstanding, absolutely outstanding. And it was an exciting Everton team to watch. I mean, it was the first time probably in the 1990s that Everton had been really enjoyable to kind of get behind. I think we all just thought this is it. We've had our blip, our Walker era, and actually Everton are back. We've got money to spend. I'm spending it freely. We've got a manager who gets the club. We're playing decent football. We're finishing higher up the table. And in similar way to kind of the Walker decline, nobody, when Royal left, before he left, the form had dipped a bit. We got into Christmas kind of top six, and then next few months, there were a few injuries that hadn't gone so well. And then the fans were still behind him. Nobody was calling for Joe Royal's head. I think we thought, oh well, we'll go again next season. It's still a work in progress. And again, he similar to Kendall, he had a fight with the owner over a transfer. I think it was Torrendry Flo he wanted to bring in, and then sort of like by mutual consent, they parted ways, and suddenly Royal was gone.
Another point, just like Liverpool. See that season, that was the first season of the Bosman ruling. And again, Liverpool were also accused of they were kind of slow on the whole how to navigate the Bosman ruling and sign foreign players. And I think Everton were somewhat like that as well that season, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, and I think we thought that the kind of ownership change would make a big difference at Everton. But I think football had changed even more than we thought. I think, but what we got, had Peter Johnson come into Everton in, say, 1988, I think he'd have been a good owner. He had the kind of money and nous that you could navigate football at that point. By the mid to late 90s, it changed completely, and he wasn't equipped. He didn't have the kind of cash reserves to really power Everton forward. I don't think he had the kind of nous to navigate the way football had changed. He felt like a late Football League era owner in the kind of modern Premier League age. And actually, despite us spending some cash, it just wasn't enough. And I think the club infrastructure still wasn't sophisticated. We still didn't, navigate things like transfers particularly well. We didn't negotiate particularly well. The Muller thing was only one example of several during that decade. We were still commercially, we were being left behind by the likes of United and Arsenal. There was still that sense of kind of I think that's the area when you have this phrase called Everton that kind of the fans use. Well, that's Everton that. That doesn't exist in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s. You start hearing it in the 90s and into the noughties where we get this sense of our club of like, oh, of course we've made a bad decision. Of course that negotiation has gone badly. Of course we've missed an opportunity there at Everton that. And it's like kind of that's when you first get this feeling that we are a club who will make mistakes, who will not do what Arsenal will do, not do what United would do. And in many ways, you can look at that kind of Royals leaving the club as that. There was, Royal was a good manager, and Royal had just gone through a sticky period, and our owner just kind of needlessly pulls the trigger on Royal, who I think would have delivered a perfectly fine Everton in the seasons that followed. And then you kind of we go into that summer and you get kind of again another illustration of how badly Everton are run. So we go into the summer talking about getting Bobby Robson as manager and bringing in this player and that player. And then we end the summer with Howard Kendall coming back for his third stint as manager, a much diminished Howard Kendall at this point. And then Johnson effectively giving him no money to spend at all. You go into kind of this is the 97, 98 season in really poor shape, whereas just 6 months earlier, we were looking good and pushing for Europe. And then we just make it a succession of bad decisions. And then we go into, I still think Everton's worst season in the modern age. I think that's the one season where I would say we should have gone down that season. We absolutely deserve to. There are other times we've been lucky to escape, and I think we've been maybe too good to drop. 97, 98, Everton were absolutely the whole season. Other teams went down who didn't deserve it, and Everton should have that year.
This third return of Howard Kendall in 97, there's a second great escape against Coventry in the last match of the season. I was going to ask you to compare the two great escapes and how did you experience and live through this 1998 one?
A very different feel to it. I think I remember I was at university, so I came back for that one. Again, even the weather was different. Like 93, 94, lovely spring day, 97, 98, typical grey, kind of Merseyside afternoon, and a very different feel amongst the fans because I think in 97, 98, you've had that change of ownership, you've had that cash injection, and we're back where we were in 94. It hasn't worked. There's a feeling this time around that maybe there's something wrong at Everton. That like this is it, maybe is this our new reality? Are we one of those teams who kind of goes up and down, has relegation fights? You don't have that feeling that it's a blip anymore. That there's the kind of we're quite sclerotic and there are issues with the club. The owner was incredibly unpopular at that point as well. We want him gone. So it's same again. You go into that game like the previous one. Even if we won, we could have still gone down. We're fighting for survival against the Bolton Wanderers, and unlike the previous one, we come out and we score early and we're 1-0 up, and then you get a good illustration of typical Everton in the kind of the closing part of the game. We win a penalty, so we should go 2-0 up. We missed a penalty. And then in the dying minutes of the game, we concede to kind of a hopeful cross into the box. Dion Dublin scores a goal, which the keeper should save. And then suddenly you've got this unbearable tension amongst the ground. I think the worst few minutes of football I've ever experienced as you're waiting to see if Everton can hang on and if your opponents for the drop have lost. And luckily again, Everton survive against the odds, undeservedly so as well. I think when you actually fall was the kind of the final whistle, relief or celebration. In 98, it's relief, definitely, but also a lot of anger as well. There was no sense of like, oh, we've got through this and we're going to build again in the future. It was palpable anger against the kind of how the club is being run. Peter Johnson in particular, definite sense that things are not right at Everton, and we are, as a club, we're not going in the right direction. We're not like we were back in the kind of late 80s, and it's I think a sense of incredible frustration and almost like panic, thinking what's going to come next? Are we going to have this the season after? It's just kind of have we changed from a team who you expect to be pushing the high reach of the table to one who are going to be fighting relegation as a kind of regular occurrence?
Kendall was expected to be sacked, but that decision kind of dragged on for most of the summer, I believe, until Walter Smith was appointed. And the appointment of Walter Smith in the summer of 1998, who had been a successful manager at Rangers, was seemingly an attempt to stabilize the club. And there were some expensive signings, the likes of Marco Materazzi, who we'll remember from 2006 World Cup final, French midfielder Olivier Dacour, who would later join Leeds, Scottish midfielder John Collins, among others. But once again, the season derails And Duncan Ferguson is even sold to Newcastle United without Walter Smith's knowledge. Now, obviously, there was understandable anger at how this was handled. As a result, Peter Johnson left his post as a club chairman. Again, Everton finished just above relegation zone, and they were only really saved by the late arrival on loan of former Arsenal striker Kevin Campbell and his many precious goals in that run in towards the end of the season. So, how did Everton fans regard this continuous instability?
It was a hard time to be an Evertonian. I think back then. I think well, Smith. Well, he wasn't a great manager. I mean, I know he'd done great things in Scotland, but there's a quite a gulf between Scotland and England in terms of kind of football. I think you're right. He'd been brought in as kind of a kind of stability candidate. We were set up to kind of not lose. Really uninspiring football to watch. You know, sometimes you'd have like five centre halves on the pitch. It was the Smith years were particularly grim. And then as the backdrop of that, you've got the kind of ongoing ownership stroke financial problems. I think, as you said, Smith had been given a transfer kitty when he first arrived, but it had all been debt financed. This wasn't kind of a cash injection by Johnson. This is kind of his last roll of the dice, I guess, as owner. And it put us in kind of financial hock, in financial trouble for the first time in our history, I guess. Ferguson was sold, absolute crowd favourite. He was sold to partially cover our debts. A huge loss to the club and the fans. I mean, Duncan Ferguson was never like a free goal scorer. He was frequently injured or suspended, but in the 90s, he meant a lot to us. He was a player who we felt got what Everton are all about. He was loved by the fans. We knew that he loved the club as well. So for him to be kind of discarded in that fashion, just kind of without kind of especially without consultations to the manager, it felt like the club was in crisis, which I think it was. We were full of debt. We weren't doing well on the pitch. Goodison, at that point, for the first time, you've got talks about the ground needing to change. I think Johnson was the first manager to talk about relocation. We were definitely falling behind our former peers who had developed their grounds. You've got this football club who are in debt, in crisis, need a lot of money spending on them, and an owner who no longer wants to be in charge, didn't want to own the club. And nobody actually really wanted to buy Everton, which is strange. You think in that kind of era of the late 90s when football was booming and an established name like Everton was seen as kind of a relatively toxic investment. So it wasn't like we had Russian oligarchs or billionaires line up to buy us. Nobody was interested. So there's this sense of what's going to happen to the club. But we're terrible to watch. The manager is not very good. The squad was increasingly poor. You've got an owner who doesn't want to be there. He's not going to spend money anymore. You're locked in this kind of crisis period, really. In the end, despite him not being seen in a particularly positive light in the last kind of few years before his death, Bill Kenwright intervened with a consortium, bought out Peter Johnson, and kind of attempted to put Everton on a kind of more sound financial footing. There was no sense that Kenwright's consortium could spend lots of money. So we were sort of locked in this period of this kind of state of relative decline, I guess. And whilst we had that and Walter Smith, each season was just we were looking at the bottom of the table and we were not enjoying going the game. And it was just a very difficult time to kind of be a Blue.
Due to Peter Johnson's overspending, sales were needed, and Walter Smith has to overhaul the team in the summer of 1999. And again, Everton finished 13 for 2000. And the rest of his years at Everton were just as unsuccessful. And Walter Smith left his post in March 2002 to be replaced by David Moyes. And this was the start of the revival. Now, despite your reservations about Walter Smith that you mentioned earlier, do you think he was constrained by institutional problems at Everton?
Yeah, there's definitely a truth in that. I mean, you'll never know what he could have been. I don't think he'd have been particularly great at Everton, but actually, as you've seen Probably some recently with somebody like Sean Dyche. I mean, I don't think Dyche would ever be a fantastic Everton manager, but actually, when you're working within tight financial constraints and you've got huge amounts of uncertainty behind you, is it easy to be a manager? Probably not. So I think under testing circumstances, Walter Smith kept us in the league just about. Very rarely had a free hand in kind of transfers, apart from when he kind of first arrived. I think he did, I think, half decent job. I think he was an okay appointment. It's a very strange time. It's sort of like as a blue, it's almost like a forgotten era. The kind of the Smith years, they were so unremarkable, really. Didn't have any of those big moments. Even some like Walker had Wimbledon and like Kendall had Coventry 3 and he had the success of the stars. Smith just had a lot of nothings. Even kind of, there was the escape via Kevin Campbell, but even then it wasn't like a final day escape. You sort of got away from it beforehand. So it was kind of a sort of like a shrug your shoulders kind of time at Everton where like nothing really happened. It was quite boring. Most of the drama I think was off the pitch at that time. It was kind of who's going to take over. He was definitely kind of hamstrung in his ability to manage, and he did a decent job. But I think even if you'd given him a fantastic transfer kitty, I can't see a Walter Smith Everton being like a Champions League side. No.
So let's look on balance. Everton had been part of the Big Four, Big Five in the 1980s, and the Premier League had been established in no small part as a result of Everton and the other big clubs wanting a bigger piece of the pie. By 1990s, Everton no longer had the same status and missed the boat somewhat. So, did the English Premier League launch at the worst possible time for Everton to capitalize on?
Yeah, I think I mentioned in the book. I say that Everton have been a well-run club for 100 years. They've been an early pioneer of football. They've been a founding member of the Football League. They really understood how football was changing. They capitalized. They built the first purpose-built football ground in England. They've been known for kind of, doing things really well. They had a sluggish time in the 50s, and then John Moores would come in, develop the stadium. We were known as the Amazing Millionaires. We'd done loads of good things and like operated effectively for over 100 years. And then we decide to have this 10, 15 year period where we decide to suddenly become the opposite of that. We don't make a single good decision. Everything's wrong. Every step is kind of a bit indecisive, and we make the wrong step, and then we just make bad decision after bad decision. This happens to coincide with the one time in English football history when it's suicidal to be like that. We become the kind of the worst run club at exactly the wrong time. Just when you've got to be really savvy, really smart. You've got to make the right decision. And if you do all that, you can just power away. You've got to think in the late 80s, Man United and Everton were similar. Two big English football clubs from the Northwest, won titles, won FA Cups. They were on parity. Maybe Man
Mhm.
U had slightly bigger international reach, but you wouldn't say that the difference was that big. And then if you look at, say, by 2001, just Man U are playing a different sport to Everton. They have
Right.
just absolutely sped away. Man U, more than any other club, understood what the Premier League was. And whilst they had got, potentially lucky with a good appointment like Ferguson, they'd made so many good decisions both on and off the pitch, and they became what they are today, like a club who can make now they can make routine mistakes. And it doesn't matter. They're that big. But Everton managed to, despite pioneering the Premier League, just not getting at all what football was. They just continued in the same vein. It's kind of small thinking. Actually, not really in the same vein. They still felt like a football league club, but a badly run football league club. They paid dearly for that in the end.
Yeah, to circle back about what we were saying about the post-Heysel ban, that may have certainly played a part, but listening to you, there are all these poor decisions along the way that compounded things that almost make the post-Heysel ban seem insignificant.
Yeah, I think the post-Heysel ban is it's emotive for us because it's kind of it felt massively unfair and it was perpetrated by our rivals. So it's always going to be, and it coincided with our relative decline, and it definitely played a part. But like you can't get too focused on that. I think Everton, even without that, Everton would still have been in trouble in the 90s. There was the seeds for kind of our relative demise were being sown in the late 80s into the early 90s. A general attitude that kind of permeated the club. You could argue, really, it's still there. It's been there until recently. Kind of you thinking under Ken Wright and then under Mashiri as well. I mean, so many examples of this continued inability to kind of negotiate properly, to structure properly, to kind of push commercial revenues. It's been there since the kind of early 90s, maybe even the late 80s. That's why we are the way we are. You can focus on the emotional impact of highs on the European
Yeah.
ban, but other clubs were banned from Europe and didn't have this. So it's
Right.
yeah, there's multiple reasons beyond that for Everton's relative decline.
Yeah. So then John Moores and Peter Johnson were unable to navigate in this new world. Either they were tight with money or did not make proper managerial appointments. But so there's like a various factors, but somehow they just were not able to compete in this new reality.
Yeah, they just didn't. I think they didn't get it. I think Peter Johnson was possibly the kind of the right man at the wrong time. I think he didn't have the bottomless pockets to really power Everton. He was almost like an old-fashioned owner. Most of football's history,
Yeah.
your owner was like a local boy made good, a local millionaire, and that's what Johnson was. He lived in the Riddle and he created a local company. He was a local millionaire. But we were going into the era of like foreign billionaires. That's what
Right.
football was becoming. He was the wrong man. He couldn't power Everton forward. He made bad decisions. And then he's followed by Ken Knight, who's again just a local boy who's got a few quid. He's not an oligarch. He's not got the kind of money that other clubs have or had. So you just continue that sense of kind of, I guess, smallness that's kind of come to define Everton.
Another thing is that also in this era, you have the likes of Arsenal, Liverpool, Chelsea. They're appointing like these sophisticated, cerebral, continental managers who are supposed to take them to the next era. And Everton are still appointing mainly British managers. So, do you think maybe that also had an effect?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, our outlook was still kind of again very kind of football league era. We're kind of putting British managers then produced kind of British football. Wenger and revolutionized English football and how they play. We're just kind of, and some of that may have been driven by just, we have to survive and therefore we can't take a risk. Equally, I don't think we were a particularly attractive proposition for a lot of managers. We were kind of, we become a crisis club by the end of the 90s. So it's saying, I think a mixture of those things, definitely maybe a conservative outlook at Everton, where we just appointed managers who we think are going to produce football that will kind of just keep us in the league, but yeah, I'm partially just a inability to think beyond kind of very rigid confines about what the club could be. And that was kind of
Yeah.
symptomatic, I guess, of how we were run.
Yeah, and in most cases, managers landed in already precarious situations. And
Yeah.
only looking back, really, Joe Royals' two first seasons were positive, while all the other seasons seem to be a struggle just to survive.
Yeah, I think Royals. I think the one exciting season, I guess, was Royals' first full season in charge when we had Kanchelskis and we were playing kind of very kind of aggressive, fast football. But if you look at the rest of the decade, I think you could say it's at best mediocre. That was kind of our best years beyond that one Royal season. At best mediocre, at worst and more commonly terrible. The open decade of bang average, and then you have these few terrible seasons as well, and then we end very kind of mediocre. I think through it all, amongst the fans, there's this weird kind of realization that things have changed. I think that was the hardest thing to deal with. That you go into this decade as Everton Football Club, a team that can win titles, and you get to the late 90s and you're thinking, I don't think we can win a title again, which is for a very few kind of elite clubs go through that change. I can only really think of maybe Leeds United. They've gone through something similar where like you're thinking, you go into a decade thinking, oh, we're great. And then a few years later, you're thinking, well, that's never going to happen again. And I think that's remained with Everton and Evertonians, the sense that our place at the top table has probably gone. And you can't really envisage it ever coming back now.
The Great Escape of 1994, and to lesser extent that of 1988, will always be part of the history of the club. Do you think this will be always referenced as part of the culture of the club, these two events?
I think so. I think they're two massively important games. I think, particularly Wimbledon, I think there's kind of what often gets forgotten about that game is that prior to that, Everton's attendances hadn't been particularly good. The atmosphere hadn't been particularly good either. Wimbledon was like a wake-up call to a lot of fans that this thing that we love really matters. And I think since Wimbledon, Everton's attendances have remained consistently high. The atmosphere, I think, got better during the 90s as well after that. And our connection to the club didn't hasn't dimmed at all. It was a huge moment for Evertonians. And I think you can't celebrate times like that. You can't celebrate like Wimbledon or recently Crystal Palace. As a fan base, you want to be more than just these kind of great escapes from the kind of jaws of death. For a club like Everton, it shouldn't necessarily be things that you kind of celebrate, but they are important. There are You look at kind of what would the club be now had we gone down then, or 98. You think of kind of other teams who went down into the championship and then they never
You
really
know,
got back.
that remind me because I remember after the 94, The Great Escape, remember Jimmy Greaves had his Come In and Shoot magazine where he would answer letters or make comments. And
Yeah.
he was talking about all the teams that season. And when it came to Everton, he said, absolute rubbish. They should have gone down. He, in fact, said that maybe it would have been good because it's the perfect shakeup that they would need.
People often say that if we go down, we can reset and we can build again. You're thinking, but do you? I think the impact of relegation can be so great on a football club that it can change them forever. You think of teams that have gone down. You think of like Leeds United, they won the
Right.
league and they went down and they've never been the same since. And you're thinking a club like Everton, when you think of what we were in the 90s, how we were run, the mistakes that we made, I can't imagine that team going into the championship and not continuing to make mistakes and how damaging those mistakes could be. So, whilst we might have gone down in 94 and bounced back, that's a possibility. We might have gone down and then just kind of collapsed. And who knows where Everton, you don't have a right to be like a Premier League team just because you've got a long history. Luckily, we did survive, but had we been relegated at any point in the last 30 years, it had gone down and even recently, there's no guarantee what happens next. You can just collapse. And despite having a massive fan base and you think, well, you work with that, there are plenty of big football clubs who go through decades of relative decline because they've been relegated. It can be psychologically damaging for the fan base. It can be kind of financially ruinous for a football club. So, yeah, I think all our great survivals need to be kind of recognized, maybe not celebrated, but recognized as massively important for the events that they were for the fans, but equally because they kind of represent a path not taken. We did survive. We didn't get relegated, and worse things didn't happen. We managed to stay in the league, and you get to a point like we are now, you're thinking, well, another fresh start, and who knows? We wouldn't be in this position. Would we be in our new grounds with our new owners had we been relegated at any point in the last 30 years? You could say probably not.
Let's trace your personal journey. Where were you in life and in your fandom in the beginning of the decade and at the end of the decade?
At the beginning of the decade, I was at school, so I'd been like 1990, I'd been like 14, I think maybe 13, 14, and kind of just going to watch Everton with my mates in the street end. When it used to cost £2 back then to go and watch Everton, which is it's insane. And you could just turn up. It was like, totally different to nowadays. And then during the 90s, I'd gone to university, I'd moved to kind of southern England, so I was more kind of a traveling fan by that point. I think kind of my relationship with Everton changed. I think when you're younger, it's a weird connection to the club. I've been lucky. I'd seen Everton as a kid. I'd seen Everton win league titles. So I really I enjoyed Everton a lot, and I thought Everton were fantastic. And I think the 90s kind of shook me a bit. I think kind of it was kind of, well, this is a very weird experience to go from winning the league and everything's exciting. You got that first flush of love of football. You're young, and it's kind of football's amazing. So it was a different kind of love of Everton by the end of the decade. I think I've been slightly slightly hurt by them, kind of what happened. As every fan does, I still love the club. Maybe in some ways it was a kind of a deeper sense of kind of attachment to them. It wasn't. I'd been through the success. I'd also experienced near-death experiences with them. A lot of kind of misery as well. I still think it's important for a football fan. I think you need to experience. It can't just be trophies. It has to be hardship. That's what kind of really bonds you to a side. So by the late 90s, I was kind of living in, I think, Brighton by that point, making longer trips to go and see Everton. And I think I had a deeper sense of kind of affiliation to them than I had in like 1989.
So, in closing, what is the legacy of Everton in this decade of 1990s? Is it more of a cautionary tale?
Yeah, I think that's a good, yeah, that's kind of a good summation of what it is. It's what can happen if you take your eye off the ball. I think that's what Everton are. I mean, whilst we were unlucky that we took our eye off the ball at the worst possible time, any club who does that is going to kind of reap what they sow. If you want to remain competitive at any tier of football, you've got to make sure you run the club properly. And I think it was particularly damaging for Everton. I think it was a kind of a watershed decade, really. It was the point at which everything you think about as modern Everton is formed, I think, in the 1990s. The way the fans think of the club, the pessimism that we kind of ingrained within our fandom, that emerged then, that Everton, that kind of mentality that emerged then, the way we fell away from our former peers that came then. The Everton that emerges in say 2000, that's modern Everton. That's kind of what we are. And the kind of the Everton that I've been a part of, I'd say from the 1880, late 1890s to the kind of 1980s, that Everton effectively, I think, dies. There's the sense of a club who are elite, a fandom who are positive, a club that is run properly. That's all gone. And I think you get this modern Everton who make mistakes, who fall off the pace, who do things, who cock up all the time. You got fans who just look on the constantly glass half empty, so pessimistic, expect Everton to make mistakes and to do things wrong. That's what's formed in the 90s, and it's formed by, many factors. You can definitely mention the European ban, but equally awful managerial appointments, the wrong owners, and just a succession of like terrible decisions at the worst possible time. And that's what the 90s are. But equally, for a lot of fans like me, lots of enjoyable times. Lots of really emotional occasions, winning the cup, two near-death experiences, one great season. Some players that you absolutely fell in love with. I loved Duncan Ferguson. I loved Anders Limpar. There were still great moments in there, despite all the trouble, and still kind of some fantastic memories of being Evertonian back then.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information and the links to your books are on the blog and podcast uploads. And this is the book Highs, Lows, and Bakayokos, Everton in the 1990s. This was published almost a decade ago, but it's a very enjoyable and very informative read. So, Jim, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
No worries. Anytime. Thanks for talking to me.
Thank you.